you. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He is the author of the book Poppy, no other than Mr. Jack Maher. Welcome to Book 101, Mr. Jack, and can you please introduce more about yourself?
Of course, and Daniel, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It's great to be able to share not only my book but just the love of literature that I hope all of your readers have. So yes, my name is Jack Maher, and I am a novelist. And this book, Poppy, a novel about a colorful Colorado life, is about someone very close to me, and I'll get into his story as we move forward here. But I am a former multimedia journalist and TV news executive. And I was with the NBC station in Denver, Colorado for most of my career, where I was the executive producer and started the morning show, the very first morning show Denver ever had back in 1980. And at that time, people didn't really look at the value of morning television. It was mostly little 5-minute cut-ins. And so the station sort of was forward thinking and decided there was a big audience for morning news. And so way back in 80, they had me produce this thing. We had a helicopter and a couple of anchors and a reporter. And that was very successful. And by the time I retired just a few years ago, that little half-hour show had grown into 4.5 hours on on two different TV stations because we ended up operating a duopoly. So it was a busy life, a lot of stress. And, I decided it was time to maybe get off of that treadmill and do some writing. And so that's how this book started.
Mr. Jack Maher, thank you so much for sharing your legacy to the world. Thank you, thank you. So, tell us, how did Poppy's early experiences traveling the American West influence his passion for Native American art?
You bet. And I'm glad you have such a nice, enthusiastic audience.
Thank
Um,
you.
so Poppy, his name was Eric Douglas. And he was really one of the people who devoted his life to elevating Native American art at a time when it wasn't given a lot of value, to be honest. And he was one of the guys with the Denver Art Museum who started this department. It was at the time called the Indian Arts Department. And that's him on the cover with his wife, Frida. And he was recruited to do this by Ann Evans. And if any of your listeners or viewers are familiar with Governor Evans in Colorado, he was infamously associated with the Sand Creek Massacre, which was a very unfortunate chapter in American history and Colorado history, where troops were sent in and they slaughtered over 100 Native Americans in a place called Sand Creek. Well, this governor's daughter, Anne, I personally think felt very guilty about this stain on her family's history. And so she just sort of plowed into a number of civic improvement projects, one of which was the Denver Art Museum. And she recruited Eric to start this department. And there was a real concern at the time, not only because of Sand Creek, but because a lot of things that the government had done to Native Americans, putting a lot of these people on reservations, forcing the kids into, Indian schools is what they were called. Anyway, she was very concerned, as was Eric and a lot of their friends, that the culture of many of these tribes, their language, their art, their music was in danger of going away. And so Eric was among this group that decided to do what they could to really convince a lot of people that this art was really something. It was made by people that had been here for thousands of years. It was really the first American art form. And so that was how he devoted his life to going on horseback with his father through the great American Southwest, through places like the Four Corners region, through Arizona, New Mexico, southwestern Colorado. And they would befriend a lot of these Native American artists, potters, sand painters, weavers, and they would, purchase their artwork and then put it in the Denver Art Museum. By doing so, the hope was that they could really combat a lot of the racism that was happening at this time in the early 1900s. Hollywood, in particular, had these stereotypes of a lot of the Native Americans, and there was a lot of racist attitudes about them. And so Eric was determined to try to reverse a lot of that attitude and a lot of those opinions. And what's interesting about him, Daniel, is he was also my grandfather.
Interesting indeed, Mr. Jag. So, in what ways did Poppy revolutionize display method at institutions like the Denver Art Museum and the Museum of Modern Art in New York?
Of course. Up until really about the 1930s, when you would go into an art museum, it wasn't a very interesting place to visit. As my grandfather, as Poppy would say, the only people that would appreciate what was in a museum at that time was an egghead. He called them eggheads because a lot of the artwork and a lot of the other material was trapped under glass in a dark cabinet. And sometimes there wasn't even, information cards telling you what you were looking at. Or if there were, they were really tiny and hard to read. So Eric decided that he wanted to revolutionize the way that museums displayed work. And what better way to start than with a lot of this beautiful Native American art that he had collected. And so what he did, he would actually take a cue from a very good friend of his in New York by the name of Rene de Harnecourt. And he and Eric were kind of thinking along the same lines. They just wanted to change museums and make them fresher and more interesting. And so the technique involved was to take a piece of notebook paper and then sketch what it was like for a visitor as they were entering a gallery. What are you going to see on your right? What are you going to see on your left? What are the sight lines? Are we going to try to just not even have cabinets? And that's what they ended up doing. They would install pedestals in a gallery. They would take a beautiful seed jar made by a Hopi artist, put it on top of the pedestal so that you, Daniel, as the visitor, would see it right directly in front of you. They would use dramatic lighting to highlight kachinas or ceremonial masks so that the lighting looked like a campfire and it would have flickers so that you felt like you were where this mask was used. If there was a particular piece of art that came from the Southwest where the clay was yellow, they would paint the wall to match the base in the pot. And again, this sounds simple, but it really was revolutionary for its time. And I'm proud to say that a lot of the techniques that he and Rene pioneered back in the 30s are still in use today. I'll bet if you go to a museum in Vancouver, a lot of the things that you will see there were pioneered by these men, and they were used to great effect.
Very well said, Mr. Jack. Very well said. So, what challenges did Papi face while commanding the 113 nurses during the World War II, and how these experience shaped his later life?
You're right. He had a very interesting career. He did spend the early years at the Denver Art Museum. But when World War II came around, he was a patriot. He felt he needed to somehow help in the war effort. And so he offered himself up to the Army because of his skill as an administrator at the Denver Art Museum. And so they decided they would put him in charge of a hospital in New Hebrides in the Pacific. And there is a chapter in my book that talks about how he is waiting for a train to take him and over 100 nurses to the West Coast, where they're going to board a transport ship to New Hebrides. And so they wanted him to basically build and staff this hospital. And once this happened, they were receiving just horrific casualties, as you can imagine. These were a lot of sailors and Marines and soldiers that were having just not only physical injuries from the battlefield, but a lot of emotional injuries and also brain trauma from what they called shell shock. Today we would call it PTSD. And so, that injury is not always apparent or visible. And so Eric, he didn't really have a lot of medical background, but in talking with these nurses and evaluating a lot of the convalescing patients, he kind of natively figured out that perhaps there was a way to help these people with this shell shock through music therapy. And the reason for that was he grew up in a home not only full of Native American art that he and his dad would collect, but it was full of sacred music. His father was an Episcopalian music liturgist, and he devoted himself to studying a type of sacred music called plainsong. And if you've ever been in a Catholic church or an Episcopal church, you may have been exposed to hymns that are sung without any instruments. They are just the voices of a choir. I guess if you would think of monks chanting, that is plainsong. It's really beautiful music. And his father, whose name was Winfred, he thought that this had the power to open windows into heaven. That's what he said. And so with this background, hearing this music growing up, Eric asked his dad if he would send a lot of these scores, these plainsong scores, for choral performances to the hospital in New Hebrides. And he did. The choirs that they ended up forming were comprised of these convalescing patients. And so, not only did he pioneer these techniques in the world of the art museum, but he pioneered music therapy in the treatment of people with PTSD. It's pretty remarkable. And he would write these letters home talking about how valuable this music had become to these recovering patients and the remarkable progress they were making through song.
So, Mr. Jack, how does the novel portray the balance between Poppy's professional ambitions and his family life?
It was, I'll tell you, a little difficult in terms of his work ethic. He worked very, very hard, as did his father. And actually, his father, it's kind of interesting if I can take a side alley here with you, Daniel. But his father worked so hard that one day they found him collapsed at the base of his organ. And this was previous to his life in Colorado. And so his superiors in New York is where this was, said, you know what? You need to get yourself better. And they figured out the way to make this man, Winfred Douglass, better was to send him to Colorado because we have dry air, high altitude. A lot of people came out here in the late 1800s to recover from tuberculosis and just all kinds of different ailments. So not only did he come out here to get better through traditional means, but again, he just kind of figured this out that he needed to go on a horse, and he took a bedroll and a tent, and he camped for 6 months in the great American Southwest out under the stars. And in the course of this therapy, he encountered the Hopi, and he befriended these beautiful people who took him under their wing. They made him a blood brother. And lo and behold, Winfred became healthy and vibrant. And so he returned to his home, and he raised Eric with this sensibility that not only did the Native Americans he encountered, the Santa Clara, the Hopi, the Navajo, had this beautiful art, but they also were a great source of health and inspiration. Well, as I said, Winfred was a hard worker. Eric inherited that hard work ethic along with the love for this culture. He was away from home an awful lot because both men did a lot of collecting. They also had a relationship with the Fred Harvey Company, which at the time they were trying to help a lot of these Native Americans with an income that had been put onto reservations. And so they convinced the Fred Harvey Company to, develop these contacts with these artists so they could make money by selling their different handiwork to tourists that would come and visit in the Southwest. But it meant that both men were away from home for extended periods. And I think from what I can gather from a lot of family letters and diaries, there was a little bit of resentment on the part of the family that were at home while dad and his dad were away so much. Eric was away helping other museums. His father was away working on this sacred music. The mother of Eric, her name was Josepha, Dr. Joe. She was one of Colorado's first female doctors. But she ended up spending a lot of time in her bedroom. And my aunt, in an oral history she recorded, said that she felt it was because Josepha, was depressed because, these men were away from home all the time. And so I think he sacrificed quite a bit to be able to do all of these things that he needed to do for the Denver Art Museum and for museums, not only around the country, but around the world. He was very much in demand as an expert and sort of as a consultant to help museums do a better job of displaying things.
So, Mr. Jack, what would be your advice for those people out there want to write their own stories, novels, or a memoir?
Well, I would say that look within your family to see, first of all, if there is a story to be told, and I suspect that there is. In my case, this story was not immediately familiar to me. I'll be honest with you, Daniel, because when I grew up, my family, we had a lot of problems. We had alcoholism and mental illness. And so the legacy of Poppy was way down on the list. Most of the time it was just, let's get through the day and make sure that we can get the rent paid and get another, plate of dinner on the table at night. And so it wasn't until many, many years later that I really got myself immersed in the world of my grandfather. But I was fortunate once I made that decision because there was a lot of material to go through. The Denver Art Museum brought me boxes of material related to his life and his career. There's a beautiful home up in Evergreen, west of Denver, which was the family home. It's now known as Haiwan. It's a museum, and if any of your viewers or listeners or yourself ever come through Colorado, I would encourage you to visit because it's a beautiful log home where Eric and his family grew up. So I had access to a lot of material, and I don't know that a lot of people may have that same benefit. But I would say no matter what your story is, your personal story you want to tell, if there are people connected to the past and they're still with you, record them, interview them, get their stories down because that is such an incredible source of material, especially if you don't have a lot of written items to draw from. And I will just tell you, Daniel, that having these oral histories from my aunt and my uncle, I don't know that I could have written this book without that. And it doesn't have to be this dramatic story like I have. It can be, a quiet story. Some of the best memoirs are of people who maybe didn't lead remarkable lives, but they had other things in that experience that at the very, very minimum is worth passing on to the kids and the grandkids and the future, generations. And then if there is, something really dramatic or interesting, then maybe you can widen that circle and get people that know nothing about you or your family to read the story. So that would be my advice.
Thank you for your advice, Mr. Jack. And what will be your short term and long term goals in writing?
I am hard at work on my second book. And
Congratulations.
thank you. This one, the first one, Poppy, I called it a novel because while it is full of real people and real events, I did have to use my imagination to fill in some gaps in the record of Poppy and what he did at the Denver Art Museum. Well, this next book is all just based on what has happened to me in the past 6 years. I've had a remarkable spiritual journey that began in the parking lot of our church and involved my beautiful Becky, my late wife, and a stranger. And I don't know if you want me to go into all of those details right now, but all I can tell you is it is a story that I have lived and that continues to surprise me the more I learn about it.
Yes.
And it has involved me going on a couple of pilgrimages. I am a Catholic, and my faith is very important to me. And so what happened to Becky and this conversation she had with the stranger, well, it is a story of faith that is so powerful that I think a lot of people are going to hopefully benefit from it. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Good luck to your goal, Mr. Jack, and we are looking forward for more and more and more empowering books like this. So to sum up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, Food 101, in its fifth season, people. Fifth season already with Chef Alessandro, one of the specialty chef in one of the five-star hotel in downtown Toronto. Please do listen to our latest episode. We are reading our letter senders all over the world. So, Mr. Jack, what personal qualities and values enable Poppy to navigate the complexities of his career and personal life successfully?
Well, I will just probably quote from near the end of the book. Poppy didn't live to be very long. He was in his late 50s when he was diagnosed with a terrible bone cancer that required the amputation of one of his arms. I only knew him because I was just 2 when he died. Um, but I only knew him as this scary one-armed giant. But in the hospital towards the end, and this is, as I say, towards the end of the book, his daughter Eve comes to visit him. And one of the last things he said to her was, "Never stop learning." And I think that sums up the resilience that he displayed. He had this insatiable curiosity, not only about Native American art, but when he was in the Pacific and oceanic art, uh, music, literature, poetry. Um, that I think is what defined him. And those words, never stop learning. And it is something that I have tried to continue in my life by writing the way I write, by having these conversations with people like you, because I learned something as well, and I think every day presents that opportunity if you just open your heart to receive it.
Certainly. People don't stop learning because we need to learn every day. So, Mr. Jack Maher, thank you so much for sharing the legacy of Mr. Poppy to the world. And we are looking forward for more and more and more empowering books to come. So, can you please invite our listeners to support Poppy?
Of course, if you just search for my name, and again, it's there on the screen, Jack Maher, Maher, and the word Poppy, Poppy, you will find it. It's in a lot of different places, but it's also on my website. And it's a bit of a mouthful, so forgive me.
Mhm.
Sandgoatmanorpublishing.com, all one, sandgoatmanorpublishing.com. And if you
Yes.
go there, I've got some multimedia, including a video excerpt of the book and a little story about their home up in Evergreen. So I hope you check it out.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Jack Maher because if you support him, as I said, more and more empowering and legacy to the world. So, Mr. Jack, thank you for your time.
And Daniel, thank you for yours and for supporting authors.
Yes, indeed, this podcast is created for you. So, more to come, people. See you soon. So, Mr. Jack, I'm inviting again to come back if you